All right, good morning, everyone. Seeing I have 9:30 on my phone, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to Trail Forum. I am Alicia DiCasola. I'm Development Director for the Carolina Thread Trail, and I'm also the moderator for this session, which is Trails for All. So just want to make sure you're in the right session. This is the Trails for All session. Our presenters today include John Koch, who is Vice President of Planning for Alta Planning and Design. We also have Brandon Gonzalez, who is a Senior Planning Associate with Alta Planning and Design. We have Lee Jones, who's the Director for Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation. And then we have Lindsay Olayede, and please correct me if I didn't quite get that right, who is a PhD candidate with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So you will hear from all of those folks here in just a minute. I want to go over just a few housekeeping items before they get started, and I go away for a little while. So we'll have about 45 minutes of presentation that will kick off here in just a minute, and then we will allow 15 minutes at the end of the session. So the whole session is 1 hour. The last 15 or so minutes will allow for Q&A. On your screen, you should see on the right-hand side a little sort of sidebar panel, and it should say Q&A, and that is a place where you can go ahead and type in your questions. Feel free to do that throughout the session, but we're going to hold questions until the end, and I'll be looking through those and asking our presenters those questions at the end. You are also welcome to vote on those questions. So if you see a question that was the same as yours, go ahead and like it or vote on it, and those will rise to the top, and I'll be sure we make sure to get those questions answered. We also, in that same sidebar, there is a chat. So you are welcome to use the chat section if you just want to post a thought, share a resource, or if you're having any technical issues, having trouble hearing or something with your video, you're welcome to go ahead and put that in the chat so that we can try to help you out during the presentation as well. So as I mentioned, our speakers can't see your questions. I'll be moderating those and asking those at the end of the presentation. And then we'll make sure to share all of them with the speakers if we don't quite get time to get to all of them today. So I would love to go ahead and ask our first speaker to go ahead and make sure you have your video and your audio on. And if you want to set up your screen sharing when you're ready, we'll go ahead and kick off Trails for All. Thank you.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. Wait for there we go. Yep, I think we can see that. So good morning, thanks for the introduction, Alicia. My name is Brandon Gonzalez with Alta Planning and Design, and I'm just really excited to be here with you this morning to talk about Trails for All. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and get us started with a little bit of a background, a high-level background on kind of what equity is. It's a little bit of an introduction to equity. So for some of you who have been working with equity at your jurisdictions or your agencies, some of this may be a little bit repeat for you, at least at the beginning. And then I'm really hoping that there's also several of you out there who this is really a kind of a first chance to really think about equity, especially when it comes to trail planning and design. So we're really going to keep our kind of equity focus as it applies to trail planning and design, because it really is such a broad topic. So next slide, please. So why am I the person, just kind of talking a little bit about equity and trail planning and design? As John mentioned, or as an introduction, that I'm with Alta Planning and Design. 95% of really what we do is focused on active transportation. It's what we do, it's what we were founded on, and it's something that I am really excited to be able to work with in my daily, every day at Alta. And in particular, over the past couple of years, I've really been focusing more on trail work and trail planning and design, which is something that I'm personally very passionate about. And we've been having a lot of internal discussions around what does equity mean, particularly with trail planning and design, as a lot of other people in the industry have been doing. And so I think with the racial reckoning that we've really seen over this past year in particular, it's really risen to a topic that a lot of people want to talk a little bit about. And so what I want to do is share a little bit about some of the discussions that we've been having internally for quite some time, and hopefully give you some tools and some ideas to take away as you're thinking about it in your own jurisdictions or agencies. So next slide, please. let's see, next slide. There we go. Oops, we skipped. It's okay. There's a little bit of a delay. But what I want to do before we kind of dive into the actual presentation, I want you to stop and think a little bit about a recent really great trail experience that you've had. Try to think maybe about some sort of an urban trail. And this is one of my favorite trails. It's actually my background. And it's a picture I took a few months ago while I was out riding on just a beautiful day. So many people out and about. It was just a really great experience. And next slide. And one of my other favorite trails in the country, this is actually from Southern California. If you've ever visited Southern California, the famous Santa Monica Pier in the background, it's a really active trail where you see all kinds of users, all sorts of different modes. If you do want to, run or bike, it's good to get out there pretty early in the morning because it is such a crowded trail and it's currently being expanded. But it just really is something that is a place that connects visitors, it connects residents. You have the natural beauty of the ocean, the mountains. It's just a really, really great experience. And next slide. And this is a trail that I'm really excited to check out here in the next couple of months, a recently completed trail in Coachella Valley, California that we finished. And you can just see from the look of it, it's high design, it's a beautiful trail. You see the mountains in the background. It's just a really, really great experience that goes through the Coachella Valley. So with those three images, hopefully you now have an image in your mind of a trail that is really important to you or a really great experience. And now what I want you to do is think a little bit beyond the trail itself and start to think about what that surrounding context looks like. What communities and neighborhoods did it go through? What did those communities and neighborhoods look like? And if you know some of the history of that particular trail, how did that trail come about in the first place? How did the jurisdiction make the decision to fund that trail, to invest in it, to spend millions potentially in the construction of that trail? And next slide. And not across the board. I don't think it's in every single case because there definitely are exceptions. But I would say that in the vast majority of cases, the reality is that wealth and power were two of the primary drivers of the reason and rationale why those trails were located and built in those particular locations and were funded as a priority. And what I'm talking about with wealth and power is power. I think about advocates. I think about kind of the people that have been able to advocate for quality of life, for trails, for infrastructure, for all of these different things in their own communities. And then when you think about wealth, you also think about the direct investment in those infrastructure projects, in trails, because we know that jurisdictions have limited capacity to fund everything. So there is a priority in determining where and how we invest in infrastructure. And the reality is we could spend an entire session on historic investment patterns, but there is some, we really have to acknowledge as part of a discussion on equity that there has been a very intentional investment in infrastructure and quality infrastructure in certain areas at the expense of and to the detriment of other areas. So if we know that that is sort of a background, kind of trend, and we know that that has happened over, the course of our history, then the question becomes, what do we do about it? So next slide, please. And so that is really the backbone for, what our discussions around equity really focus on. If we know that there was something that, caused an equitable, investment of something, then how do we go about and fix it? And I really like this graphic because it shows the difference between equality and equity. And I think it's really important for us to kind of focus on the difference between the two because they are different. So on the top graphic, you see equality. And I kind of like to think of this as, like the Oprah scenario, where it's like everybody gets a bike, you get a bike, you get a bike, everyone gets a bike. And everybody's jumping up and down and they're all excited about getting a bike. But the reality is that bike might only work for, half the people in that audience. It's just sort of a, feel good type of thing that we say everybody gets a bike, but it doesn't really dive any deeper. Equity, on the other hand, really causes us to dive deeper. And I know this is a simplistic example, but in the kind of giving away bikes and providing a bike for everyone, I like to think about equity as you're diving into some of the rationale, background, history. You're diving into what people really need, and you're tailoring solutions, and you're trying to mitigate, issues and problems that have existed. So they are very different. So, and I think a really nice demonstration of this is with equality and equity and trails planning is, are we simply saying that from this point on, we're going to equally distribute trails across the community? That's a very noble and a good thing to do. but it doesn't necessarily rectify or get at some of the disadvantages and also some of the inequalities that have existed in the past when it comes to investment in trails. So next slide. So who are we generally talking about? What groups are we talking about when we generally say, when we're talking about equity? Some of them, kind of most common ones that we know and we think of are people of color, age, and age is an important one because it's also, we could be talking about children, people under the age of 18, but also people over the age of 65 or senior populations. Income, disabilities, language barriers, transportation access can mean a number of different things, from areas of vehicular ownership, access to transit, access to existing trails and active transportation facilities, basically the ability for somebody to be able to move around to their job, to recreate, to move around their neighborhood and community. Health indicators, often with heart disease and some other things that we kind of look at as a general health indicator. There's a number of different things that we can talk about when we're saying equity, and a broad range of different groups that you can be thinking about within your own communities. So next slide. Um, I want to digress just a little bit when we're talking about equity and move over to health for a second. And there's a specific reason why I think health is a really great way of demonstrating the impacts of inequitable distribution of trails. And one of the things you'll hear a lot is, well, it doesn't necessarily matter where specifically we invest in trails, as long as they're located within the community, because they're public, they're open to all, so everyone can access them. But there is a very real difference in the ability to have close proximity or to closely access a trail, and also to be able to make it a daily part of your life. And so we know that the benefits of trails are increased physical activity, increased attention capacity, social connection by being out around others. All of those things decrease stress and improve our mental and physical health. I think that most of us in the room as people passionate about trails, we get that, we understand that. So next slide, please. And this pyramid is something that you may have seen before, but it basically is showing that when we're talking about community health, there are certain things that we can do that have larger impacts on improving our health than others. And down to the second at the bottom, you see changing the context to make an individual's default decisions. And that's really important, our default decisions healthy. That is really getting about our built environment. And so the point of this is to say that if we know that there's health benefits that trails create, and we know that based on kind of some of the health research that's been completed, that our built environment and access and default decisions that we make every day better impact our health, and access to trails, for example, better impact our health, then there is actual disparities in where we locate trails. And it is really incumbent upon us to make sure that we are equitably distributing trails and the benefits that trails provide to all areas of our community. So next slide. And this sort of gets at kind of that social equity piece, recognizing those benefits and those inequitable distribution of benefits. I really like this quote from the American Planning Association. I'm a planner as a background, so I really like that it says that planning for social equity means recognizing planning practices that have had a disparate impact on certain communities and actively working with affected residents to create better communities for all. So this is where I want to transition a little bit from some of that background information that sets us up for why we need to do what we have to do on focusing on equity, into that action that APA and others are calling for. So next slide. So this is an example of an equity analysis. And this is something that essentially takes, if you think back to a previous slide where we have a lot of different groups of people that we kind of consider those equity populations. So what we do is we essentially take a number of those different demographic data from the census, and we compile it in a number of different ways. This is at the census tract level because it's for a full county. And we're able to do a composite to see where higher concentrations of vulnerable and disadvantaged populations live. This isn't too different from what a lot of jurisdictions and communities do when you think about, race or income. But the difference here is that we're really thinking about a composite of a number of different vulnerable populations and helping to identify where those concentrations might be. And there's a lot of different things that we can use, we can do with this information. So for example, from a planning perspective, one of the things that we can do is start to determine, do we have trails, existing trails in some of the areas where we have higher concentrations of vulnerable and disadvantaged populations. As you're planning for trails in the future, you're able to intentionally invest and plan for trails in these areas very intentionally. As you move into kind of the implementation stage of prioritizing trail projects and segments, you're able to potentially give a certain weight to projects and segments that are located in areas with higher concentrations of vulnerable and disadvantaged populations. And I really love this graphic because there's a quick story here that if you look in the middle of the screen, you see the red area, the higher concentration. I'm currently working on designing a trail, the Parkland Trail, that essentially goes north to south through that area. And that is a very intentional investment by the county to invest in an area that has previously been neglected. And it's also an area with without a lot of sidewalks. It's an urban area. There are definitely challenges with designing a trail through here, but the county is choosing to intentionally invest there. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, there's just want to leave with some general thoughts on how to better incorporate equity in trail planning through kind of the 5 main stages that we think about with trail planning and design. So first of all, for outreach and engagement, it is really important for us to be thinking about meaningful engagement. And I know that this is something that we've probably all aware of, we all know, but we have to be making conscious decisions through funding and through the way that we approach engagement to really have meaningful outreach. And one of the best ways that I think that we can do that is through understanding who our community-based organizations are and leveraging them and partnering with them. If you don't know who some of your community-based organizations, your CBOs are, I'd really encourage you to look into that and find out who they are and build relationships with them. On the master planning side, like I said, you can use an equity analysis tool to ensure that you're equitably distributing trails across your community and intentionally focus in investing in trails in areas with higher portions of vulnerable populations. When it comes to implementation, again, that equity analysis tool really becomes a great way of thinking about all of the priorities that you use for your ranking of trail projects, and putting in equity as a prioritization weight allows some of those projects to rise a little bit higher than what they would in a just purely equal prioritization system. Design and engineering, I think, is a really important one as well, because if you go through the steps of planning and implementing projects, you also have to equitably fund those projects and make sure that we're not necessarily spending more on high design in certain areas, in certain communities, than we are in others. And I think also culture and branding, reflecting the culture of adjacent neighborhoods into the branding and design schematic is really important. I love that jurisdictions all have kind of design themes, but those design themes can also reflect and include some of the context of the local communities. And then finally, maintenance, making sure that we're being responsive to issues in maintenance in all parts of the trail system and not necessarily focusing on areas that sometimes have the loudest voices. So next slide. So I just want to leave you with just a few questions to kind of be thinking about in your own organization, in your own jurisdiction and community. Is equity being considered at all in decision-making at your jurisdiction or within your community? Think about that and find that out. And if it's not, consider being an advocate for it. How has investment in trails been happening in your communities? Are there certain areas of the community that have seen more trail investment than others? Are there certain areas that the trails are being invested in higher design than others? It's good just to know and think about some of those inconsistencies so that you can, again, be an advocate. What does equitable trail planning investment look like in your community? As we talked about, there's a lot of different categories that we're thinking about when we talk about equity. And so think specifically about what those communities and who those communities are in your own city. How does your community approach capital planning and funding priorities? Are you considering equity as one of those ranking factors when you're deciding which projects you want to implement or which segments of trails you want to construct first? And then finally, I want to leave with probably one of the most important is, do the loudest voices drive priorities and investment? I know that a lot of you out there, because this is a trail conference, are trails advocates. And I love that. And I thank you for it as somebody who's passionate about trails. Keep doing what you're doing. But what I would really charge and encourage you to do is think about trails that are not necessarily in your backyard. They're not necessarily trails that you would use yourself. And just as you advocate for trails in your backyard, advocate for trails in other areas of the community that sometimes don't historically have the loudest voices. And I think that's a way that every one of us can make a really big impact. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay for the next section, and we'll look forward to your questions towards the end.
Brandon, I'm going to jump in just for a moment here. I'm here for the comic relief on the panel. I had the good sense to bring these smart people together to talk about this topic, and I offered to advance the slides, and somehow I managed to get a face shot on the screen. But let me just back up a little bit and give you a bit of context about the panel. Brandon Gonzalez, who is a consultant in Alta's Seattle office, hails from the southwestern part of the United States, has worked with communities in multiple states. Just to kind of give you a big picture of kind of the equity approach and an approach from a different region. Lindsay brings kind of the perspective of funding and advocating from the nonprofit sector and now in the academic sector. Among other things, she worked for the Rails to Trails Conservancy and is now at UNC Chapel Hill, and will bring some of her perspectives from her work and her current research. And then finally, we wanted to bring also the perspective of an implementing agency. And so Lee Jones from Mecklenburg County Park and Rec was kind enough to offer his time and talk about how the county is implementing these principles in the work that they are doing at the planning and implementation level. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay, and then we'll look forward to your questions at the end. And yeah.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Lindsay Oliade. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of City and Regional Planning at UNC Chapel Hill. And today I'm going to share 3 lessons for equitable trail development. Next slide, please. So just a bit about me. Early, as John mentioned, early in my career, I worked at 2 national nonprofit organizations. First, I worked at American Rivers, which works for the protection and restoration of rivers and watersheds. The organization is well known for its annual Most Endangered Rivers report. And then after that, I spent 3 years at Rails to Trails Conservancy, where I worked on the trail development team. I provided technical assistance to local organizations and trail managers across the country, and notified communities of upcoming railroad corridor abandonments through the early warning system. And so perhaps I interacted with some of you during that time. I also coordinated outreach for trail projects in New Orleans and Washington, D.C. as part of the Urban Pathways Initiative to encourage trail use among low-income populations and communities of color. And then most recently, prior to coming to UNC, I worked as a transportation consultant at ICF. Next slide, please. So my presentation today reflects on my experience at Rails to Trails Conservancy, and it's somewhat framed by my academic research interest in transportation equity. I'll discuss trail access, both physical and perceived, as well as the importance of programming. And I've included an example from practice to illustrate each lesson. Next slide, please. So the first lesson is proximity does not equate to physical access. Next slide. So let's first take a step back and think about the broader context. Historically in the United States, rivers and railroad corridors commonly served as boundaries between segregated neighborhoods. Discriminatory housing practices often relegated minority and low-income residents to neighborhoods located across the river or on the other side of the tracks. And though these policies were eventually overturned, in many communities, these boundaries of segregation persist. Next slide, please. In 2015, the Washington Post published an article about how in the United States, railroad corridors and rivers largely continue to divide many cities along racial lines. And so here is the analysis of Hartford, Connecticut. The railroads are represented by the gray dotted lines. The predominantly white areas are in blue, the predominantly Black neighborhoods in green, and the predominantly Hispanic areas are in orange. Next slide, please. And here is the analysis of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The river is represented by the gray line on the eastern side of the city. The predominantly Black areas are separated from the predominantly white areas to the west by Highway 41 and to the east by the river. And then the predominantly Hispanic areas are south of Interstate 94. Next slide, please. And so the awareness of historical context is important for two reasons. First, it considers that the perception residents in these neighborhoods have towards rivers and rail corridors may be shaped by the historical context of community separation and patterns of industrial development along the rivers and the rail corridors. And secondly, excuse me, it underscores how low-income communities and communities of color might perceive trails that are developed along rivers and railroad corridors, because traditionally these have not been welcoming or accessible spaces in many communities. Next slide, please. So here's a concrete example. One of the projects I supported through the Urban Pathways Initiative was the Lafitte corridor, the conversion of the Lafitte corridor into a greenway in New Orleans. And this was one of the keystone recovery projects after Hurricane Katrina. And so for those of you who are familiar with the geography of New Orleans, the Lafitte corridor runs from the edge of downtown through Treme and Mid-City and Bayou St. John and on. And so to understand the access between the corridor and adjacent neighborhoods, we conducted a physical audit with the help of local volunteers to enumerate and assess sidewalks, crosswalks, curb ramps, intersections, and amenities. Next slide, please. And here's an example of what we found. Excuse me. In this map, the Lafitte corridor is in bright green. The red lines indicate where sidewalks are non-existent, and the yellow lines indicate where sidewalks exist but are poor quality. And so as you can see, many of the streets immediately surrounding the corridor had poor quality sidewalks, if any sidewalks at all. The pedestrian connection from these neighborhoods leading to the trail was quite inadequate. Next slide, please. And so the second lesson is proximity does not equate to perceived access. Representation matters. Next slide, please. There was an academic study published this year that noted the importance of representation and increasing the use of trails among youth from under-resourced communities. Specifically, that the lack of seeing role models on trails is a barrier to trail use for some populations. Next slide, please. To help encourage more inclusive and diverse use of the Lafitte Greenway, Rails to Trails Conservancy helped to create the Lafitte Greenway Ambassadors Program. The ambassadors are a rotating group of community leaders from each of the Greenway's adjacent neighborhoods. The ambassadors serve a 6-month term and are paid a small stipend for their time. The ambassadors promote the Greenway, sharing information with their neighbors and friends. And perhaps more importantly, the ambassadors model for people from all walks of life that the Lafitte Greenway is a space for them to use and enjoy. Next slide, please. And the final lesson is programming connects non-traditional trail users to the trail. Next slide, please. And so I want to convey here the importance of programming for supporting trail equity, because it helps to overcome some of these issues of physical and perceived access. It's important to understand the interests of non-traditional trail users and then develop and implement ways to attract them to the trail through community-driven programming. Next slide, please. So in 2010, a new segment of the Metropolitan Branch Trail opened in Northeast Washington, D.C. The trail was hidden visually from the adjacent neighborhoods by large industrial buildings, and the red line for the metro system runs along the other side. To raise awareness about the trail in the community, Rails to Trails Conservancy hosted a series of events that first summer that the trail opened, referred to as Meet the Met. We partnered with a local charter school located on the trail, neighborhood groups, and local artists to host multiple activities along the trail, including a grand opening event with a ribbon cutting, healthy food demonstrations, community gardens, exercise and yoga classes, a 5K fun run, and mural paintings. The Meet the Met series introduced residents in adjacent neighborhoods to the trail, many of whom, from what we knew anecdotally, were not initially aware of the new trail. Next slide, please. And so I'd like to end with this quote: "Regardless of good intentions, if we fail to take into account the needs of vulnerable populations, we are in danger of creating systems that reinforce existing inequities." And this pandemic has really reminded us of the importance of access to trails and greenways for physical and mental well-being and all of the other benefits that Brandon spoke about. As we work towards trails for all, it's so important to think beyond traditional notions of proximity and access. If not, we risk reinforcing these inequities. Next slide, please. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you. I'll pass it over to Lee.
Lee, you can take it away.
Thank you, Lindsay, and good morning again, everyone. Once again, my name is W. Lee Jones, and I am the director of the Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation Department. And I'm happy to be able to speak to you today on our trails and parks for all. A little bit of background about myself. I actually started off not seeking a career in park and recreation. I became a licensed architect and practiced in several areas for about the first 10 years of my professional career. And then I worked for three governments: Arlington, Virginia, Prince George's County, Maryland, and now Mecklenburg County. And in the first role, I was a facilities planner. Second role, I was the deputy director and acting director later of a environmental regulatory agency, similar to what we have in Mecklenburg County, Louisa. And then for the past 16 years, I've been with Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation, with the past 3 years being the director of the department. Let's go to the next slide. This is just a symbol of just an indication of what we have in terms of our amenities and facilities. The chart on the far right, if you glance at that, will tell you about the number of athletic fields and trails and things like that we have. But I'm very proud of our park system, as is our park and recreation family. And what makes us unique is for the past 16 years, we have recruited and been able to retain highly talented individuals, particularly in our capital planning section. And those individuals are professionals, and most of them are, I don't think any of them have degrees in park and recreation, but they have degrees in architecture, landscape architecture, and planning, which makes them prime for having a certain sensitivity to design and being able to interpret what the needs are and translate them into actual facilities. Let's move on to the next slide. Right now, what's really driving us is our system-wide master plan. And that master plan is used to evaluate our current facilities and program offerings. And the one that we're working on now is called Meck Playbook. And Meck Playbook started that effort back in the summer of 2019. And some of the things that you heard earlier are how we're proceeding with Meck Playbook. We know the importance of extensive public engagement throughout this process. So we've had a variety of workshops, and small group meetings, and we've captured through our consultant over 2,400 memories. We've had 312 workshop participants at different times, and 88 public focus group participants. And granted, we did a lot of this during the COVID-19 pandemic, so we had to change the way that we did our community engagement. hence Zoom, WebEx, those types of different types of social media or digital media to be able to engage folks. Then to make it valid, we've done a series of statistically valid surveys of our households and various participants to make sure that we've captured the opinions and input of all residents of Mecklenburg County. And our draft report for Meck Playbook, our upcoming comprehensive master plan, is under review, and we hope to have it endorsed and adopted in early FY21. Let's move on to the next slide. So with Meck Playbook, the recommendations that are going to come out of Meck Playbook fall into four main categories. Commit to equity, and that's going to help us make improvements and close gaps. Evolve and grow. You know, our county assets really need to keep pace with population change and change in demographics and meet the needs of our new and existing communities. Finally, then we need to tell more stories, and that's to increase the awareness and impact that public recreation and our park and recreation system has on the public, and then to move beyond boundaries, to better connect the system and the people, bring people into it. Next slide, please. As it says, we have a variety of parks and open spaces, but we're going to dive in a little deeper, and I want to talk a little bit about the principle of commit to equity. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, what is the state of our system? You know, early in our Meck Playbook process, we conducted an analysis of a lot of our amenities, of our parks, our trails, and our facilities within the system to rate their quality on a scale from 1 to 5. You know, 5 being the best condition and 1 being the worst. We found that in general that our large parks and preserves and greenways are in excellent, fair, or good condition, and they're safe and they have a lot to offer. Most often these types of places and amenities are newer. Next slide. But also through this in-depth assessment, we learned that many of our neighborhood parks and facilities need updates. They need help. These places are often older, they're well loved, and in neighborhoods with a lot of dense activity, hence creates a demand on these park and recreation amenities. Next slide. You know, our lower rated parks are in our high priority communities. And we found that most of these, what I'll call low rated places, are in what we call, again, I reference to the higher priority communities. The areas on this map that are shaded in light orange here, the map, are defined by these higher population densities, lower incomes, higher population of youth and seniors, and greater proportions of communities of color. When we combine all these demographic metrics, we find that large area in the center of the county in the zone that most needs reinvestment in public spaces, first and foremost. Next slide, please. And then we talk about, you know, the fact that not everyone is within a 10-mile walk to a park, a 10-minute walk to a park. We also want to think about where there aren't parks to inform how we approach new investments in public space. When we talk about quality, now we'll talk about quantity. You know, one common metric that's used in assessing, you know, the quality of a park system is to look at the walkability. This means measuring how long and how far residents live and how many live within a 10-minute walk to a park. And the map here, the orange shape, indicates zones within that 10-minute walk space. The most walkable parks that we find, parts of the county, in the uptown Charlotte area and parts of Davison and Cornelius, two of our northern towns, while most of the suburbs lack walkability. But what we also recognize is that aiming for the entire county to have a walkable access to parks is not realistic, and maybe it's not the most important goal. Mecklenburg has suburban and rural parts where driving is more common and may occur in that way. And the way that the county is laid out, particularly to develop residential areas, there are a lot of cul-de-sacs which limit accessibility. And also, you know, you have to think about this, you know, Charlotte is the home of the NASCAR Hall of Fame. Next slide. You know, we found that gaps remain when we consider driving to parks too, because when we looked into whether Mecklenburg County residents can drive to a park within 10 minutes, you know, we use the data on transit use. How many people walk, how many people bike or ride transit to work? It was determined an area where walkability really does matter and where it matters less. And we see that zone is concentrated along transit lines and in central Charlotte. You can see those boundaries in light orange on the map here. Everywhere outside those boundaries is more suitable for driving. Here, the blue shapes represent the 10-minute drive from a park. Once we consider driving in addition to walking, the areas that noticeably lack parks do decrease, but there's still gaps. So these missing pieces can tell us where new investment may be most critically needed. Next slide. Here's another comparison of equality and equity that Brandon spoke so fluidly and Lindsay touched upon also. So together with these two studies on investment and reinvestment, they can guide our understanding of equity in this context. Commitment to equity in Mecklenburg County means targeting investment where the need is the highest, whether that's refurbishing specific overlook parks or creating new public amenities in areas where facilities don't exist. When special care is given to overlooked places and facilities in the system where everyone has equal access to beloved and cared for places that reflect their own desires. Hence, it's not necessarily the squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's that you need to really apply the development of upgraded and new amenities where the need actually exists. Next slide, please. You know, we believe that committing to equity can really help us rebalance the park systems, both in terms of quality and quantity of parks and trails. In some places, poorly maintained parks are located in neighborhoods that are also plagued with lack of investment. And that's also reflective of crime. In working with our Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department, we work and we get crime statistics. And what we found is that the crime in parks is directly reflective of crime in neighborhoods. So when we have areas that are big areas without convenient access to a park, we need to tackle equity with these two different but interconnected levels. We need to fill gaps so that everyone can easily get to a park, and we need to ensure that every park is held to the same standards of maintenance and quality. So someone won't say, that's a bad park, that's a good park. Next slide. We're going to have more detail as we move forward with Meck Playbook when it's released early next year. And it will talk more about addressing equity based on the information that we're able to glean. Next slide. Let's talk about the Meck Playbook approach to trails. You know, Meck Playbook has recommended an approach specifically to trails that will prioritize connecting, expanding, improving, and communicating trails. We see trails as being transportation corridors and recreation amenities. But more importantly, the trails are the methodology and the fabric that links our park and recreation system together. And they also link neighborhoods and specific nodes of the city and the county and the incorporated municipalities together. From an anthropomorphic perspective, it's like if the county is a body and all the parks are different organs in the body, then the trails become the capillary and blood flow system that provides life to these separate areas. Next slide, please. One thing that we're working on now is our accelerated Greenway plan. Right now, we have more than 55 miles are completed, and we have a goal to add an additional 30 miles of new trail between 2019 and 2023, which is the 5-year period of our capital improvement funding plan that the county has adopted. To meet that goal and to meet the community demand, we and our partners are working on the accelerated Greenway plan that includes over 40 miles of trail currently in design and construction. And that's a very aggressive goal. We have several Greenway projects that were placed on the accelerated timeline, moving their protection completion time to FY20, when originally it was planned to be completed later. And that is to meet that need. And we had buy-in from the constituents and from our elected bodies. And the projects were selected using the following criteria. Property ownership, if we already had the land, so we didn't have to spend time doing that. The geographic location. We wanted to ensure geographic equity in putting these facilities where they're needed. And we wanted to be able to build a minimum of 2 miles of trail, because more miles of connected trail provide greater impact and offer greater opportunity for use. And finally, ranking these projects. They rank these projects that are part of the accelerated Greenway plan through the ranking methodology, ranked in the top 30 of our undeveloped Greenway projects. Next slide. It's also important to remember that all of the new projects are in design with public meetings beginning to take place now and planned throughout the next cycle in our budget cycle in the upcoming year. We're currently on track to be able to meet our target of 30 miles of new greenways on the ground by the end of 2023. Next slide, please.
Lee, the slide is not advancing.
Okay.
So go ahead and talk through it, and I'll see if I can make it work on this end.
Okay, thank you. The next slide is going to show you a map, and I can talk about that, of our new Greenway projects. And it shows how they're being dispersed. It shows the location of all Greenway projects that we're working on through the accelerated Greenway plan. But the map also shows projects that are funded in our 5-year CIP, our capital improvement plan. So that being said, we've worked very diligently to try to make sure that we're covering, thank you, John, there's the map, that we've covered all the areas to provide an opportunity for what we refer to as geo-equity, giving access and potential use and connectivity to these trail projects. The blue dots show the projects that are funded in that 5-year CIP, and the magenta dots represent the 5 new projects that were funded last year, new projects that are part of the accelerated Greenway plan to meet the demand and increase access to our trail network. I won't call out the specific projects, but they're all listed here on the map. Next slide.
Well, it's not moving again.
If it doesn't accelerate, that's fine. Because my next slide just says thank you. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to receiving any questions you have at the end of this program.
Thank you, Lee. This is Alicia back here. I actually would love to invite anyone to post any questions in the Q&A or in the chat. Right now, we don't have any, so hope it's working. And folks just don't have any questions, but we have about 10 minutes, so please feel free to go ahead if you'd like to post a question for one of our presenters, or if you had any issues, please let us know in the chat, or if you had any feedback as well.
Alicia, are people allowed to state their questions verbally also?
Unfortunately, I don't know if we have a way to sort of, I think folks could try to unmute themselves. They can. I'm not sure if that's something I can do for them. Let me look and see. Right now, all of our guests are muted. But if someone wants to do it verbally and wants to post in the chat their name, I can see if we can unmute you. Yeah, there's nothing at the moment coming through. Also, I'd say if any of the presenters had anything else that maybe, they didn't quite get to or felt like they had to go through a little quickly, or any other points you'd like to make. Oh, let's see, we might have something here.
I have a question for Lee, actually. So on the two trails that I mentioned, both of them have docked bike share stations at select points along the trail to make bicycling on the trail more accessible, more broadly accessible to those who might not own personal bicycles. Is there integration of Charlotte's bike share system as part of this trail development plan?
That's an excellent question, Lindsay, and the answer is yes. We are working very closely with the bike initiative in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, to make sure that, first of all, our trails can accommodate bikes. And there are different types of bike trails, as you know. Some people want the high-speed trails, and we're experimenting with that down at one of our new park developments at Pearl Street Park. One suggestion that had come through a while ago at Romere Beard Park to be able to take the curved road that goes throughout a major uptown park. But we decided to step away from that and work more closely with the Cross Charlotte Trail to be able to do that. That being said, we have incorporated bike stations, bike share at Romere Beard Park, at areas of the Greenway, and at Freedom Park, to name a few. And part of the recommendations that are going to come out of this Meck Playbook will probably guide us into best locations that we can place bike stations to be able to access the trails and make them more usable for that transportation medium.
We actually have, thank you, Lee. We have a few questions that were just posted. So if it's okay, I'll go ahead and share those. And John, maybe you can help with what speaker you think would be the best.
Sure.
So Penelope asks, what new methods are being done for public engagement during COVID?
Well, Brandon, do you want to take that? And then Lee or Lindsay, Lee's spoken a little bit about it, but Brandon could take that, and then Lee or Lindsay jump in.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Obviously, we've been doing a lot of like virtual pivots and things like that, but the problem intuitively with virtual pivots is that we're assuming that everybody uses, those virtual means or phones, online engagement at the same level, and we know that that's not necessarily the case. So what I've seen in a couple of projects that works really well is, again, looking at the community-based organizations and the CBOs, because CBOs right now, especially, are having a lot of really important work due to the pandemic and serving, vulnerable communities and populations that have unfortunately been some of the hardest hit by the pandemic. And so they're already having to continue doing a lot of the outreach and work through services. So building those partnerships with the CBOs and figuring out the best ways to kind of reach vulnerable communities, particularly right now, has been a really successful thing. And then sometimes it's even leveraging some of the work that they're doing for materials, for input. But one of the things that we also have to be really careful of is that there is a lot of stress and anxiety in communities right now. And so while we look at, trails and parks and all the things that we're really passionate about, and there is obviously the importance with it, we also have to understand that there's a lot going on and there's a lot of, real issues that communities are dealing with. And so I think that that's another reason that reaching out and involving your CBOs helps to kind of establish that messaging and figure out when certain things are appropriate and when things are just, quite frankly, not. So anyway, I think that it's a combination of a number of different factors, including the CBO outreach.
And I'll add on to that. It is definitely important to sort of be sensitive to kind of what the community needs are. And at the agency level as consultants, we've all been super sensitive to sort of the greater economic and health and social challenges that are happening today. But we'll give you an example from one of our West Coast partner communities where, as consultants and as the agency leading an active transportation planning project, we approach the community very gingerly, like, hey, maybe this is not the right time for this plan. Maybe we put it on pause. And again, as Brandon said, every community is different. This particular community, community that had been hit hard by the pandemic and by economic issues, they said no, full steam ahead. In fact, we're doing our own outreach through phone trees and through some of the web applications. So I think it's being sensitive, but also providing the range of outlets, and thinking back to some of the old school things, we're beginning to see things like postcards, public service announcements on Access TV, using text to access a broader range of communities, because we know 90-something% of American households have access to mobile phones where they may not have access to the internet. So Lindsay or Lee, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Outside of, we started Meck Playbook prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we already had the momentum going, but what we've done outside of using Google Meet, Skype, Zoom, or WebEx, we actually got some software that would allow us to be able to engage a larger size group, but that, some of the criteria you talked about earlier, access to computer, access to, a smart device, a smartphone, limits that availability. So what we've also done is utilize, you reference snail mail, postcards, allow people to reach out to our park administration department if they were trying to get a permit to use a shelter, which we're not, at least not our shelters, but we still use that methodology to reach our people. But one thing that we did is we've also held a couple of socially distanced outdoor sessions under large tents with people socially distanced who really wanted to come out and give their input. We've limited those, but we did something similar to that for the Druid Hills community in Charlotte off of Statesville Avenue along that corridor, and it was very beneficial. We're also helping a community over by the Dowd House off of Wilkinson Boulevard and Remount Road to be able to plan for an upcoming event that will be socially distanced outdoor for some of our special needs population, whether it's seniors or those who are challenged in some physical way, their families are and don't have the opportunity to get out, can provide their input, because it's important for us to cover every demographic that we can.
Lee, we had another question I think would be perfect for you to answer. Jason asks, what ways does Mecklenburg County and the 6 towns fund these various projects? So I think, trails, parks, and all those things.
That's a very good question. We used to fund it through what was called bond referenda. When I first came here in 2004, I came here in May, and in November we had a bond referendum and we got $69 million, and that started us being able to build greenways, our sports complexes, and a couple of key projects, the Revolution Regional Sports and Learning Academy, which at the time was our largest recreation center of 30,000 square feet, and Romare Bearden Park. But those funds are approved by the board, and they're actually, you use the borrowing methodology based on the county's credit. Secondly, we use what we're called COPs, certificates of participation, that did not require, it was just accumulated funds that did not necessarily require board approval or a referendum to be able to use those funds. Of late, we've been using tax revenue, because the county's tax revenue was so good that for the current funding cycle, FY19 to 23, we've used those funds. But we also are all about partnerships. So on some projects, we've partnered with entities, educational institutions, churches, working directly with the towns, and including the city of Charlotte and other incorporated municipalities, to help in their individual master plans to be able to make these projects move forward.
Thank you, Lee. I think we'll need to wrap up soon. I had one more question I'm going to see if we can squeeze in really quickly here. And it is, how do we promote equity within the ETJ and or rural communities that have an abundance of green space, but is mostly privately owned, but by definition do not have sufficient infrastructure or economic development. So how do we promote equity within ETJ and or rural communities? Is there anyone, John, that you think might want to take that for the last minute or two here?
Do you want to take a first crack at that, at least as it relates to Mecklenburg County?
Sure, I would be happy to. Well, one thing that we're doing, excuse me, is we have, and I don't want people to take this the wrong way. We have an aggressive land acquisition program. Our land acquisition is funneled through one entity, which is Asset Facility Management Real Estate Office, but they work collaboratively. That agency works collaboratively with us to go for this land. And we look at areas where there's very little infrastructure, where they don't have water and sewer. And I'll give a good example. In Mint Hill, we just finished or substantially complete with the Stevens Creek Nature Center and Nature Preserve, a brand new nature preserve. So we work with the city and with the town of Mint Hill and Charlotte Water to be able to bring in water and sewer for that community for the planned growth. Because we've seen it when we build these type of facilities, it brings additional residential growth and commercial growth. So that's how we've been able to do that, to try to tie it in with short and long range planning for community development.
And I'll say, working with your land trusts, like the Catawba Lands Conservancy, I mean, we are so blessed to have so many great land organizations in this region to help facilitate land acquisition or easements, and your agency, your utilities, as Lee mentioned, are great potential partnerships in rural areas, and volunteer organizations as well. Alicia, do we need to wrap up?
We do. That is it for our questions, and there's no other comments in the chat. So I'd just like to say thank you, John, Brandon, Lee, and Lindsay. And if this is the end of the session, there's no other final words.
Thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks to the panelists.
Thank you.